Hi, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazine. Thank you for being here today. We have a sample of a video for you. It's called Expressive Pastel Painting, so you can loosen up and get more bold in your painting. It's Karen Margulis. I think you'll enjoy this.
Hello everyone and welcome to the studio. My name is Karen Margulis and I have the pleasure of sharing the wonderful world of pastels with you today. Through my demo, we're going to explore pastels and their vibrancy and their versatility. And I'm also going to be able to showcase how we can use pastel to help us loosen up and paint with more expression. Now for today's demonstration, I'll be painting one of my favorite subjects, wildflowers, grasses, trees, under the light of the setting sun. That's going to give us a lot of material that we can use to help us interpret what we see in front of us and paint with more expression. One of the things that I like to do when I paint is to use my reference material as a jumping off point, to jumpstart my memories and my imagination so that I can interpret what I see through my own voice and tell a better story. I want to invite the viewer into the story and have them participate. So I'm going to have the perfect balance of detail and a little bit of mystery. I want to be able to take out that all-important artistic license that we all have, but we don't always use to the best advantage, and use it to interpret what's in front of me rather than feeling like I need to copy it exactly. Now, one of the other things that I love to do when I paint and also when I teach is to simplify things. I like to be able to get up to my canvas and be able to approach it with confidence. And I know that if I have a plan in place, I'm free to let go. My philosophy on painting is make a plan and then plan to let go. In fact, it works for a philosophy on life, and I use that a lot. But when I approach a painting with a plan in place, then I know where to go, and I'm never lost, and I can paint with confidence. And when I get up there, then I can let go and paint with passion and be more expressive with my mark making and with my color choices. So what I'm going to show you today is my very simple step-by-step way of approaching pastel from the very beginning, mapping out our plan. Then we'll go through the underpainting process, the layering process, so we can get some really interesting layers of pastel colors without making the dreaded mud. I'm also going to be showcasing how we can capture that light of the late afternoon sun, that wonderful glow that we can capture. And I'm going to show you how we can incorporate texture into our pastel paintings. That's not something that we can easily do with pastel. But I've got some good tips and techniques that will help us really punch up the texture and the depth in our landscape paintings. I'm going to share all this and more in today's demonstration, so I want to invite you to sit back, relax, enjoy the video, or paint along with me. I'd love for you to paint along. We're going to have a lot of fun today, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, before we get started with the painting, I want to take a few minutes to set the stage. I want to discuss a little bit more about what it means to paint with expression. What does it mean exactly to loosen up? Well, the definition of expressive is to promote emotion or feeling or thought. And that is precisely what I try to do in my paintings. As I said earlier, I want to tell a story with my paintings. I want to invite the viewer into the painting so that they have some interesting things to look at, and then they can exit gracefully, feeling like they've had a satisfying visual journey. That's my goal. But how do I get there? Well, there's some strategies that I've adopted that have helped me loosen up, paint with more expression, and really tell better stories with my paintings. But what I want to talk about first is that there's also something that we need to do that will help us paint with more expression. The idea that when we work from photos, the photo captures the moment in time. But a painting has the ability to go beyond that, and it has the ability to share the view with the viewer, not only that you were there for that moment in time, but how you feel or how you felt about it, and invites them to share in with that journey with you. Now also, when we paint with more expression, it has to do with how we handle our medium. So pastel, for example. Well, how do we apply the pastel? How do we make our marks? How do we layer for interesting color? How much do we put in and how much do we leave out? We want to have a little bit of mystery so that viewer can have a part in the story. So how can we go about doing that? Well, I've got some strategies that I put into practice when I first started painting, and they made huge differences in the way I was able to be more painterly, was able to loosen up and paint with more expression. Now, these are not the overnight quick fixes, and I know that when we watch videos, we always want something that's going to help us right now, to help our paintings. We want to improve our paintings right away. I've got you covered. We're going to do that too. But I want to go over these strategies because truly they were game changers for me and they made a huge difference in my paintings. All right, so I want to go over them. I have a little bit of a visual aid that we can look at that will go over these 5 things. They're not in any particular order. They're all important. But I wanted to share them with you, and maybe you would like to adopt them into your art practice as well. So let's start with number 1. Rethink the way you use your reference material. I'm going to talk more specifically about using reference photos. Now, I probably work from photos 90% of the time, and it's really important that when we're working from photos, we realize that there's limitations. So photos don't always capture the subtleties that we could see with our eyes. So sometimes things are too dark, sometimes things are too light, sometimes we don't get the subtle shift of values that we would see in real life. Take shadows, for example. You see photos with shadows, cast shadows, and oftentimes they look black. Now, if we were to copy those in our painting and made them black, it would not look, it might look like holes. It would not look as realistic or believable or lifelike. So how do we solve this problem of photos that are not always telling the truth? Well, one really great way to do that is to get outside and paint plein air. That's really going to give you the information you need to interpret your photos and to be more expressive with your interpretation. If you don't get outside to paint, there's another suggestion I have. Go outside and paint in your head. What does that mean? That means go outside, look at a scene, and pretend you're painting it. Ask yourself art words. Like, what do I mean? Well, what colors do I see? What shapes am I looking at? What are the values? How about the edges of that cloud? What's happening up there? Now, what you're doing is you're feeding your brain with all of this information so that when you look at a photo that is less than perfect or maybe has those limitations, you're able to interpret the photo with more informed decisions. So that's number 1, understand the limitations of the photos. But I have another tip for you, and this was a game changer for me. When I first started painting, I thought that I had to have a huge photo to work from. Like, I would print out my photos 8 by 10. Then I advanced to the iPad so that I could pinch and zoom and see all the details. That was a problem for me, because what ended up happening is I put every detail in my painting. And I really didn't want to put every detail in my painting. I wanted to move away from the photo. As I said, I wanted to paint with more expression. But the big photos were making it hard for me to do that. So I adopted this practice of working from small, crummy photos. That's right, small, crummy photos. And I just print them off on my inkjet printer, several to a page. Usually they're about 2 by 3 inches. Now, why do I call them small, crummy photos? They're not really crummy photos, but they're not National Geographic quality photos. They show the bones of what might be a good painting. Interesting shapes, maybe an interesting color, maybe interesting light and shadow patterns. Then I can take these smaller photos and make more interesting paintings. Actually working from these small photos where I can't see detail gives me the freedom to paint with more expression and really make better paintings. So not seeing the detail really frees me up. So reconsider the way you work from photos if you do work from photos, and try a small, crummy photo. By the way, when I go out and I take reference photos, I'm not looking for the perfect composition. I'm really only looking for something that's interesting that will give me a jump start for an interesting painting. Maybe a color, maybe a shape, that kind of thing. So I'm not really worried about getting the perfect shot in my reference photos. So that's number one. All right. Number two, adopt a wonder what happens if attitude. It really truly is all about your attitude when it comes to painting with more expression. A lot of times I think we approach painting with a little bit of fear and a little bit of concern, and we get frustrated when things aren't going our way and we don't feel like we're doing a good enough job, and we get frustrated with our paper because it's so expensive, and we want to do a good painting every time we step up to the easel. I'm going to suggest that you change your mindset if you identify with this. Adopt this attitude of playfulness, of experimentation. When I go up to the easel to paint, I want to just play and have fun. One of my favorite sayings is, those things that are learned without joy are soon forgotten. So if we're frustrated with ourselves when we paint, we're not going to have fun, and we're not going to paint enough, and that's what it's really going to take. So have fun, be playful, and if you ever find yourself asking, can I do this? Or I wonder what would happen if I tried this, the answer should always be, let's give it a try, and we'll find out. Because it's fun. And this idea that paper is precious or paintings are precious, that holds us back. A great attitude to take is that it's only paper. Sometimes we treat paper that it's too precious, or our paintings are too precious. And we're afraid to use the good paper, the expensive papers. But in reality, the expensive papers can be repurposed very easily. So we can even wash off a painting or try different ways to revive the painting. So in the end, expensive papers are really more cost effective, and you're never not good enough for the good stuff. Keep that in mind. So it's only paper. Wonder what happens if attitude is going to go a long way in helping you to paint with more expression. All right, number three, organize your supplies for painting with more efficiency. And this is a funny one for me because I'm not really the most organized or neatest artist out there. In fact, when I was growing up, my mom put a sign on my bedroom door that said, "Creative minds are rarely tidy." And I guess that gave me permission to paint my walls and all the projects that I always had going on. So I'm not very organized, but there's one thing that I do that I keep organized, and it is a game changer, another game changer. We always start off with one box of pastels, but very quickly our collection will grow. It's just the part of being a pastel artist. And before you know it, we've got a table filled with boxes. And when we go to paint, we've got to look through all those boxes to find the right color and value for our paintings. Well, early on in my painting career, I bit the bullet and bought that expensive wooden box, and I organized all my pastels loosely by color and by value. It made a huge difference in the way I painted. I could paint with more efficiency and in turn be more expressive, loosen up, if you will, because here's why. I was able to go over to that one box, and I had a limited selection of pastels. And if I needed a color or a value, I had it right in front of me, rather than having to go hunt through 5 or 6 different boxes. Think about what happens. You're painting, you're in the zone, you're really enjoying the process, you're being intuitive, and you're playing with marks and colors. Then all of a sudden you realize, I need another blue for the sky, and you've got to go over to your table and go through all your boxes. You are just jumped right out of that intuitive, painterly mode to now a very analytical mode. You're switching gears, and it's really hard to then jump back into the painting. Now, on the other hand, if you are organized with your pastels all in one box together, you can stay efficient and you can stay in that zone and really just play with your painting. I actually take this one step further, and when I start a painting, I pull out the pastels I'm going to use for that painting into one tray. And I'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But organize your supplies, especially your pastels. You don't have to get an expensive box. You can take a gallery wrap canvas, turn it upside down, you have an instant tray for your pastels that you can use in the studio. So organize, it's going to help you be more efficient and more expressive. Number 4, study. You want to learn all you can about painting, not just mastering the technical aspects of your medium, such as what is a hard pastel versus a soft pastel, how do we make those fat sticks, make those tiny little marks, what is an underpainting and how do we do them? We need to learn all that. But being a technical master does not always mean you're going to have successful paintings. We also need to learn about the concepts that make a good painting: color theory, value, composition, edges, how to create depth. It's overwhelming sometimes, the amount of information that we really need to process. So it's important that we take time to study. Now, you're watching this video, so I know that you are in that place. You are studying and you are trying to learn all you can about painting. So I'm going to caution you. There's something that can happen, and it happened to me, to where you study and you kind of know all the basics. You've got that covered, but yet there's still a struggle at the easel, and you're still frustrated sometimes with your paintings. Well, Robert Jen coined a term that I love about this, and he called it educosis. And it's funny. What it means is you know all there is to know about painting, but you still get frustrated at the easel with your paintings. And the cure for educosis is to practice. It's really important that we do that, and that leads me to number 5, which is practice. Now, we all know how important it is to put in time at the easel. You've heard the phrase, put in the miles of canvas. Practicing is key to helping take the knowledge that we're accumulating so that it becomes more intuitive, so that when we go to paint, we don't have to think or overthink every step that we make, because we put in enough time at the easel where those things that we learn have become intuitive. One of the best things that I did, and this was another game changer, was I started a daily painting practice. Probably I'd been painting about a year, very frustrated with my lack of progress. I had a friend come to me and say, you know, it's great you're going to a class every week, but you leave your pastel box in the car. You're not practicing. So I started to practice a small study, 20 minutes every day, and then within a month's time, I saw progress. It works. It really does work. So I will encourage you to make time to practice. So these are 5 strategies that I have implemented that have helped me be more confident when I paint, and confidence does lead to more expression. But I promised the quick fix, and that's coming up. All right, before we start painting, we have to gather our supplies. So this would be a good time to introduce you to the materials and supplies that I use for pastel painting, and more specifically, what I'm going to use for today's demonstration. So, pastel is pretty simple. All we really need are a few pastels and something to paint on. We don't need a whole lot. Now, how many pastels do we actually need? That's a good question, because it's really easy to get a lot of pastels, and I admit I probably have thousands of them at home, but we don't need that many. Probably you need around 100. If you think about getting each color on the color wheel and having, say, 3 values of that color, having some warm and cool, having some intense colors, and also some of those grayed down neutral colors, you will have a nice comprehensive set of pastels. What I like to do is put them all in one box, as I talked about earlier. This is my travel box. It is got a variety of pastels loosely arranged by color and value. Now, you will see prettier boxes, you'll see more organized boxes, but this works for me. But basically, you can see the dark ones are at the top, and they gradually get lighter as I go towards the front of the box. I like to work from a limited palette so that I can be more efficient and so that I avoid color chaos, and we'll talk more about that. But I actually take it a step further when I paint, and I pull out of the big box, and at home I have a much larger studio tray. But I pull pastels out for each painting, and I put them in this butcher tray. They sell these for paint mixing palettes, but I just use them to pull out pastels for each individual painting. I'm going to talk more about how I came to this selection of pastels for the painting when we actually get to that part of the demonstration. But just to give you a look at, this is a studio box or my travel box, and then I pull out pastels for each painting. So what else do we need to paint? We need a surface to paint on. So we need paper or a board. And now pastel artists are so lucky because there's so many choices. We can paint anywhere from drawing paper, even printmaking paper, all the way to nice hard surfaces sold specifically for pastels. I'll be working today on a sanded paper this white sanded paper. It's nice and thick. This is actually Luxe Archival sanded paper. I'll be doing a wet underpainting today, so I want to make sure that the paper stays nice and flat and doesn't buckle when I get it wet. Some sanded papers do tend to buckle if you get them too wet, unless you mount them on a board or another hard surface. This paper works really well for a wet underpainting. I also like to use white when I do a wet underpainting because I find the colors are more vibrant. If you do a wet underpainting on a gray paper or even a toned surface, they seem to be a little bit duller. So white is the way that I'm going to go today. Then we need to have a painting surface where we attach our paper to a board. I'm just going to use foam core, and I use artist tape to attach my paper to the board. What I do is make hinges. Basically, you put some tape in the corners, sticky side up, tape them down. You have tape on all four corners. It saves a lot of tape, and it exposes the entire piece of paper because I will paint all the way to the edges of the painting. I use artist tape. And I only use black or white. I don't use painter's tape, I don't use masking tape, and I'll never use colored tape like the blues and the greens. Because what you do is you're introducing another color to your palette. And you really don't want to have another color because it can influence your color selection, your color choices. So I stick to neutrals, white or black. Now, what else do we need when we're painting? Well, I'm going to do two things to this painting. I'm going to treat the surface, and I'm going to be using clear gesso, not regular gesso. And I'll explain why clear and what clear does. It just happens to have a little grittiness to it, so it creates a sanded surface. And that's one thing about the papers that I talked about earlier. Sanded papers tend to take more layers of pastel. And that's really the beauty of pastel, is the ability we have to create multiple layers where all the layers are working to make an interesting blend of color. So the more grit or tooth the paper has, the more layers it will accept. Using the clear gesso is going to give me a little bit more tooth to even a sanded surface. I'm also going to use a pastel ground. This has a little bit more texture than the clear gesso, and the two of them are going to work together, and which I will demonstrate when we do the underpainting stage. You need something to do the wet wash. I'm going to be doing an alcohol wash. I'm going to be using regular rubbing alcohol, 70%. You can use 90%. You can actually use any liquid. If you want to use odorless mineral spirits, if you want to use water, if you want to use vodka, I've done that, it works. Any liquid to liquefy the pastel is going to work for your underpainting. I like to use inexpensive brushes. So you see here I have an inexpensive craft brush. The harder they are, the better for me, because I really like to push the paint around. So I don't really like to use sponge brushes or soft bristle brushes because I really want to get in there and get aggressive with the paint. Next, I'm going to be using Workable Fixative. So I never spray my painting with a final fixative. I usually just give it a good tap on the back, and that dislodges any pastel that happens to be loose. This is just a bottle of alcohol that I sometimes will spray in place of the fixative because I don't want to spray this inside. It doesn't give quite the same effect, but it is a workaround if you don't want to use a workable fixative. All right, then over here I've got our barrier cream. I don't wear gloves or finger cots, so I'll use a barrier cream on my hands to give some protection. Then we have up here an odd assortment of tools. I call these my scraping tools. I'll be using those to create texture and to correct mistakes. I've got these little guys here. I call these super tools, and I'll talk more about them, but really they're just old brushes that I've sharpened the ends, and they come in a lot of good use. I'll put them to good use. I've got a clip or banker's clasp, and I've got palette knife, and of course I will use a pencil just to do my drawing. This little guy is a steel tip pin, and I'll use that for texture and for making corrections. Then the final piece of equipment that I'm going to use is this piece of foam core that I've scored on the back, and then it creates what I call a gutter. Now I like to work standing at an easel with my board perfectly upright. That will allow the pastel dust to fall down into this gutter. Pastel dust is actually pretty heavy and larger particles. We think sometimes, oh, pastel, we're creating this dust, cloud dust of pastel, and that's not really, that doesn't happen. It will fall straight down. The only time we put it into the air is when we blow on our paintings. So that is like one of my big no-nos. You never want to blow on your painting. If there's dust buildup on the painting, you want to give it a good tap on the top or the back of the board, and that will dislodge any dust and it won't put a cloud of dust in the air. So you want a gutter. And oh, by the way, if you can't work standing upright at an easel, I recommend, if you have to sit, to still use a tabletop easel. When you work flat and you build up dust, you kind of risk incorporating the dust into your pastel painting and making it a little bit muddy. So anytime you have to sit, use an upright easel. That's going to give you the best results. So that's basically it for the materials that I'll be using for today's demonstration, and we are ready to get started with the painting. All right, now the fun part begins, the underpainting stage. What is the underpainting? It's the setup. It's what we put underneath the layers of pastel. Now, underpainting can be simply a layer of pastel, or we can use really any medium to start the pastel painting. We can do a wet underpainting, or we could do a dry underpainting. One of the very easiest underpaintings or block-ins to do is to just simply apply pastel and rub it in, a dry wash. But I want to kick it up a notch today because I want to do a wet wash. A wet wash gives us more expressiveness. And after all, we're trying to loosen up and add spice to our paintings, and there's no better way to do that than by starting the painting with a wet underpainting. Because wet, we relinquish a little bit of control. We don't have total control of what's going to happen when we use a wet medium or when we wet pastel. We get interesting drips sometimes, we get blooms, we get all kinds of things that are unexpected that give us something interesting to respond to. Now, if you find that you copy the photo or you tend to be too tight and controlling over your mark making, starting with an unexpected kind of fun, serendipitous underpainting really opens up the possibilities. And I know that it will give us some really interesting things to respond to, which will help us kind of create that depth and interest in the weedy stuff that's going to be in our foreground. So I'm going to do a wet underpainting, and I want to take you through those steps right now. What we're going to do is, the materials I'm going to be using are some harder pastels. Now, I talked earlier about pastels being hard or soft, and really it depends. They're all the same. They're all soft pastels. Well, why are some called hard? It kind of gets confusing. It really depends on how they're made, how much binder versus pigment is in the makeup. So to have a hard pastel, you have more binder in the formula and less pigment. So they're harder and less pigment is released. These are good pastels to use for the underpainting stage because they won't fill the tooth of the paper up as quickly as the softer ones. Now, the softer pastels will have more pigment and less binder. So they're like thicker, you'll get more pastel off on your paper, but when you wet them, they tend to clog the tooth of the paper if you put them on too heavily. So we'll stick with the hard pastels for this underpainting stage. I have a selection of hard pastels. I have a range of values from a dark to a light. I decided to use some warm colors for the most part for my underpainting. By the way, underpainting, that's a huge topic. There are so many questions about underpainting. What color should I use? What underpainting technique should I use? How to preserve an underpainting so that we don't cover it all up. Because really the beauty of pastel is oftentimes leaving parts of an underpainting peeking through. It's hard to answer those questions because there's really no right or wrong way to do an underpainting. There's no right or wrong choice in colors, for example, for an underpainting. There's no easy answer. The thing that you need to understand is that every choice you make will have an impact on the final painting. And the only way you're going to know what that impact will be is through trial and error and through experience. The more underpainting choices you try, the more you will be more intuitive with your choices. So I know from past experience that I want to really get a warm glow going on in my painting. So I'm going to use some warm colors in my underpainting just to give that a head start. I also want to throw in a few cool colors, so I have some blue as well as the oranges and reds, because I really want to punch up the difference between the dark areas and the light sunlit areas. So I know I really want to punch up the darks, add some cool to give a little bit of balance to the warm colors. So that's how I selected my pastels. Now we're really ready to begin. What I've done is I don't have my reference photo. I put that aside. And I know that's scary. Not to have the photo there is a little bit scary. I'm even going to turn it over because I don't want to be tempted to look at it. What I am going to do, though, is look at my value thumbnail. And because I hopefully did a good job with my value thumbnail, it's going to give me all the information I need. So I'm going to look at my value thumbnail. I'm just going to use a pencil, but I am going to use a light touch. I do want to point out the tape hinges that I talked about. These are just in the corners. I'll sometimes put them in the middle of the paper, especially when I know I'm going to get a really wet underpainting, so that I ensure the paper stays flat. So the first thing I'm going to do is just draw in those big simple shapes, starting with the horizon line. Now I didn't mention this earlier when we talked about the thumbnail, but part of deciding where you're going to put your shapes and designing your painting, your composition, you want to ask yourself, well, what is most important? We decided, or I decided, that it was all about this tangle of grasses leading us into the distance and that warm late afternoon sunset glow. So I raised the horizon so I can showcase more of the grasses. I also decided that I wanted one larger tree, and I want it to be an interesting shape. So I'm looking at the shape I created in my thumbnail, which is a much more interesting shape than the actual trees in the photo. The trees in the photo, if you remember, were kind of just like round, lumpy shapes. They were not very interesting. I want to have a variety in my shapes in both the sizes of them, the placement of them, the spacing between the shapes. I don't want anything to be the same. So I have my 3 tree shapes. I put this guy, he's going to be in the background. Remember, I had some distance stuff, so I'm going to indicate stuff that's in the distance. Could be trees, could be a hillside. And then we had that really interesting foundation pathway that's going to zigzag our way through this meadow. And I'm putting it in the beginning because I need to have a strong foundation for this painting. In pastel, well, the way I work is from big simple shapes and gradually refine till I get the detail. It gives me more control over where the viewer looks. I'm trying to create a visual journey for the viewer so that they can see all parts of the painting. This foundation pathway is going to help me lead the viewers into the painting and will provide support for all of the grasses and flowers. All right, so I've got that drawing in. Now I'm going to start to apply the hard pastel. We are going to liquefy this hard pastel with rubbing alcohol, but we first have to apply a thin layer. So I'm going to take the darkest value and I'm going to look at my value map. The value map tells me the trees are the darkest value. So I've got a dark value orange, and I'm using a light touch. I'll talk more about touch when I start layering with the softer pastels. But basically, I work with a very light touch for as long as I possibly can. I don't want to press too hard and make the marks too thick, because then it's going to possibly get gummy once I start to liquefy it. So keep a light touch. You know it's a light touch if you can still see the paper underneath. Notice that I'm connecting these dark tree shapes. I don't want there to be spotty values. So if I have lots of little dark and light shapes, things tend to be flat and I don't get as much depth. So I'm connecting them in these early stages. So that's number 1. Then I say, okay, I'm just following the map. That's why it's so simple. We have a map to follow. What is the light shape? The sky. So I'm going to choose the lightest value orange pastel. And I'm going to use a light touch and very lightly apply it to the sky area. That's the lightest area. Then I look at my map, and my map tells me that the distant area here, trees or mountains, was a middle dark value. So we have one that's a little bit lighter than the darkest, but not as light as what I'm going to put down in this area. I am also going to use this middle dark for this foundation pathway. What's left? Just this area here. I check my map. That's the middle light value. So I use the middle light pastel. So that I have roughly a simple 4-value map of color. But I want to do a little bit more to it. I could very easily leave this alone. This could be the underpainting. It's a value map. I know where my darks are, my lights, and my middle values. But I really want to get the contrast between the light and the dark and the glowing orange. So I'm going to introduce some darker values and some cooler values. So I have a nice dark blue. And in the dark areas where the shadow or the shaded side, which is, we know the sun is going to be right in here. So pretty much the left side of these trees on this side, and then the right side over here is going to be the darker value. I'm going to actually darken the foreground as well. One of the things that is really something that we like to do in pastel is when we do an underpainting, we want to preserve the underpainting. So if there's something interesting that happens, we don't want to cover it up all the way. Now, for it to be considered a pastel painting, we need to have 80% coverage of pastel. So if we have a wet underpainting or another medium underpainting, we have to have at least 80% coverage, but we can still use very thin layers, and that will allow the beautiful stuff that's happening underneath to peek through. So I'm really pushing the dark so that I can get that contrast. I have a nice blue-gray, or a grayed down blue, I should say. And I'm going to put it back over here in the distant areas because I know to create a believable feeling of depth, we need to use lighter or duller or cooler colors, and that will help us get that feeling of depth. So I'll just throw a little bit of that in there just to help push it a little bit more. I have some other colors that I pulled out just to add a little bit more interest to my underpainting. I have a dark red, so let's go ahead and get more of that glow going on. I'm going to add some of that dark red to the sunlit side of the trees. Well, the sun is just about set in this scene, but we still have some illumination going on over here on the right side of the trees. And I like how the light is filtering down into the grasses and flowers, so I'm going to add some more of that red right in here. I also have a nice yellow, warm orangey yellow, and that's where the sun is set, so I really want to enhance that, push that a little bit more. So I'm going to add a little bit of that to my underpainting. I have another one. This is another orange, just to add a little bit of complexity to my layers. And what I have now is the start of an underpainting. At this point, I could just rub it all in and I'd have a nice dry wash. But remember, I want a wet wash because I want to see if I can get some interesting drips and something fun to respond to with the pastel. So I'm going to take that next step and I'm going to liquefy the pastel with some rubbing alcohol. I've already poured a little bit of rubbing alcohol into a little glass dessert container. You got to get the dessert containers so that you have them to use for your painting. So I have my stiff brush, my cheap brush, really the messier the better as far as I'm concerned. And I have a little paper towel, a little bit of paper towel, because as I wet the brush, I want to tap it on here so that it's not super wet. This is the fun part about the wet underpainting. knowing just how much liquid to add so that you get drips, but you don't have things go totally out of control. The other thing, and I learned this the hard way, when you do a wet underpainting, slow down and take your time. Now remember, I'm an impatient painter, and to me, all I wanted to do was get it wet so I could move on to the next stage. But when I started to slow down and I treated the underpainting as just as important as the pastel layering, it made a huge difference in my work. So think of yourself as not a house painter, but you're now an artist. And really what you're doing is you're turning the pastel back into its liquid state. Because pastel, after all, is pure pigment, the same pigments that we find in oil and acrylic and watercolor. It's just mixed with a binder, a little bit of water, formed into a paste, and that paste is made into shapes either by hand or by machine, and that's why you get a pastel. When we liquefy it, like I'm doing now, we are putting it, essentially turning it into paint, liquid paint. I start always with the lightest value because it's hard to keep the alcohol clean and you don't want to have to keep emptying it. You don't only want to use one shot. So I try to control by starting with the light and then gradually going to the dark areas. Now, I don't mind drips. I embrace the drips, but I don't want it to drip too quickly because then it just kind of erases everything and everything becomes a blob. In fact, the way I used to do underpaintings before I realized I needed to slow down is I just wet it from top to bottom, and I'd wonder why I just had one big blob of color. I had totally destroyed anything that I'd set up as far as the value map by just going too quickly. So slow down, let drips happen, but try to also have restraint and control. So now I've move down into the lower portion of the sky. Now I need to go to the next lightest or darkest area. In this case, it's going to be this grassy area. So I'm going to start up at the top, where right underneath the trees. Now, one thing that I'm going to do is when I'm doing the underpainting, I think in advance about how I might apply the pastel. What kind of strokes might I make? And I'll do the same with the brush. So I know that in the distant part of this meadow, I'm going to have horizontal strokes, so it will lay flat, because we wouldn't see the upright grasses way in the distance. So I'm already thinking in advance of how I might paint with the pastel, and I'm going to do the same thing with the brush. As I come closer to the foreground, then we start to see all the grasses. So this is where I start to really kind of scrub in the paint. Remember I said I like to use stiff brushes because I really like to scrub in the paint, and this is where I get to do that. I don't want to go over to this really dark blue area too quickly, because if I did, it's going to just make the alcohol too dark and then everything will just get muddy. I'm already starting to get some really interesting drips happening. Look at this red coming in here and these orange marks. It's really a lot of fun to see what happens when we liquefy the pastel. All right, so I think now I'm going to move on to the blue areas, the distant stuff, distant trees. Now watch what I'm doing. I'm kind of just pushing that brush so that I can get a feeling of foliage, right? So I'm just kind of tapping it and trying to get a really nice rough texture. Now I'm going to move on to these darker tree shapes. So I'm moving into the dark shapes right now. Let's start with this smaller tree shape. Now, one thing that might end up happening in the underpainting is things might start to merge. You might start to lose some of your shapes a little bit. Don't really panic about that. This is just what's underneath. I'm going to put in some trunks right in here. Just make some brush marks to indicate some tree trunks. This is just the foundation, right? Big, simple shapes of dark and light, some color thrown in. We're going to gradually, as we start adding pastel, refine these shapes so that they become more clear, that they start to come together, and we will then have control over how we orchestrate the viewer's eye movement. In other words, where do they look? Where do you want them to look? Is going to be where you add the clarity and the contrast. And we'll get into all of that. Right now we're just setting the foundation. We're building the foundation, building a house, or let's just say you're getting to build your dream studio and you're really excited because you want to hang up the paintings you've collected and you want to put down the rug and bring in the easel. You want to decorate. Decorating's the fun part, but you didn't lay the foundation and you haven't put up the walls yet, and you've got to do all that stuff. It's not so much fun. The decorating is fun, but we run into problems when we decorate too soon. So by starting with big, simple shapes, gradually adding detail, gradually decorating, we're going to have more success. So we already have some really interesting things happening. It's going to take, well, it depends on your conditions, but usually not too long with rubbing alcohol, maybe 20 minutes or so. And as the alcohol evaporates, that's when we'll start to see all the cool little drips and spider webby things. So once it's dry, we can reevaluate it. Now, typically this would be the end of the underpainting stage, and I'd be ready to add pastel, but we're going to kick it up one more notch, and we're going to add some texture to this underpainting. Hi, I'm Karen Margulis. Welcome to my workshop. In this video, we're going to explore the pastel medium, and I'm going to share my tips and techniques that will enable us to use pastel to help us loosen up and add more expression to our paintings. I'm going to be starting off sharing my very simple map approach to starting a painting. And then we're going to move on, and I'm going to share ways that we can introduce texture to our pastel paintings. And that's unique because it's hard to get texture in a pastel paintings, but I've got some ways that I want to share with you that will really help us pump up that texture. I think what's holding students back often is they jump in too quickly and don't slow down enough to make a plan before they start. I like to say make a plan and then we plan to let go. And that's what's going to help us paint with more expression, is to go into a painting having a plan in place so that you can approach that blank piece of paper with confidence. I think any time that you can have a step-by-step map approach, which is what I like to call it, it gives us confidence to approach the painting, and we overcome that fear of failure and the fear of messing up our paintings because we have something simple to follow. It allows us to loosen up and add that life into our paintings rather than feel like we're compelled to copy everything we see in front of us. These are very simple step-by-step methods that can be applied to any subject. We're grounded in the basics. We need that for everything we paint, and we can use all of the things that I share for anything you would like to paint. This video will really help students' painting skills because we go back to the basics. So not only the basics of what makes a good painting, color, value, composition, but I also teach tips and techniques on handling pastel so that we get beautiful layers of color without creating mud. And I introduce how to create light and how to create texture, and all these things will result in stronger paintings. I think what's really exciting is the ability we have to create interesting underpaintings. The texture part is a lot of fun, but I also share how we can layer pastel to get beautiful color without creating mud. And I teach you how not to overwork that painting, which is also a trap that we get into often. So I've got a lot of great tips that I'm going to share that will help us have great paintings.
Well, that is Expressive Pastel Painting with Karen Margulis. And you can learn more about the video at painttube.tv. And we have a discount code for you today only. You can find it in the comments section. Take advantage of that. Now here's our interview with Karen. Hi there, I'm Eric Rhodes, publisher of Fine Art Connoisseur and Plein Air magazine. Today our guest is Karen Margulis, and she is a world-class pastel artist. Welcome, Karen.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, it's really fun to see the kind of work that you produce and the quality that you get. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I am always curious where the journey begins, right? So you're making your living as a pastel artist. you're successful, but there was a time when you weren't an artist at all. How did this all happen?
Well, I started off as a child just loving to draw and paint, and my mom put me in an oil painting class for adults because there was nothing for children in our area.
And that area was
And
what?
was Boca Raton.
Oh.
At the time, that's, you know, we went to the art guild, but there wasn't a children's class, so that's where I started. But then there was a long break in between because I went to school for elementary education, married, kids, started a daycare business, and then when the kids got into high school, I had more time. I decided I've got to get back into do some art.
So was this something that was always in the back of your head?
Always, yeah, and I always did crafty type things, but I really wanted to get back and paint.
So you were doing oil painting
As a child.
as a child.
Right.
That's pretty unusual.
Yeah.
Usually children are started out with watercolor
Right.
or acrylic because of the mess.
Right.
So you're raising your family, you're running a daycare, the kids are less demand on
Right.
you now.
Right.
So you're thinking what?
I'm thinking I need to get out. I need to do something for me. I'm going to take an art class.
And where was that?
So that's in Atlanta, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay.
Yeah. So I started with a watercolor class,
Uh-huh.
and that was not successful for me. It just wasn't a match at the time. I like watercolor now.
And you do watercolor?
Yes, yes. I like, especially with sketchbooks. You know, I do a lot of watercolor sketchbooks.
Now? So why was it not a match at the time? Why didn't it resonate with you at the time?
Well, you know, and if I look back at it, I was putting it on too thick. You know, I was treating it as if it were an oil paint. And to be fair, the teacher was not encouraging and didn't really know how to present it. And I think that really affected me.
So you were trying to do watercolor the way you did oil.
Exactly.
And the teacher didn't catch that.
Exactly.
And so you got frustrated.
Right. I would have given up
Yeah.
had I not taken a pastel workshop, like they had a one-day thing at this art center.
Yeah.
And I fell in love immediately. It was like, this is it. This is what I need to do.
And what was it about pastel that you fell in love with?
It was just the immediacy, that all I had of just a few sticks of pigment and the paper, and you know, I could make something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And no mess really, besides having to wash your hands. But other than that, it was great. And I thought, this is going to fit my lifestyle because I have all these children I'm taking care of. I really don't need to have paints and brushes and all of that to deal with. So pastel was going to be it.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting message in all of this too, and that is that, you know, here you are, a just regular person like the rest of us, and you go and you take a class at a local art center, which many of us have done, and at some point you transitioned to a professional, and at some point you became known as one of the great pastel artists alive today. That's a pretty big deal. And I think that says, you know, anybody can start this, anybody
Sure.
can do that. So what is your message to anybody who is like, I'm not sure if I've got the talent, I'm not sure if I've got it in me? What would you say to them?
And actually, those are my favorite people to work with now that I teach, because I've been there. I know what it feels like to get frustrated or to think that I'm not good enough or I'll never be able to do this. You can do it. And the message is to put in the work. It does require work, and I think I come across a lot of artists who get frustrated because they're not making progress, but they're not trying hard because they're not having fun. So for me, it's all about enjoying every step of the journey, even when you're a beginner, to know that just having fun is going to help you paint more often, and that's where you're going to get to that next level.
Well, when you're painting, you're having fun. I mean, to me, even if I'm trying to learn something, I'm trying to learn more about certain mediums now, and it's frustrating,
Right.
but I'm still having fun.
Oh,
I'm
sure.
playing and
Sure.
getting my hands dirty, and so
Right.
I think that's very good advice. Now, there's this big debate that a lot of artists have about born with or acquired talent.
Right.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think you know, for some people it might come a little bit more easily, but you still have to work at it to pull it out, you know. And it's, even if you don't think you have talent, like how many people say I can't draw a straight line, but you don't always need to draw a straight line. If you can learn the basics and still produce something and still have a really enjoyable experience with it. And if you work hard enough and you put those things that you have to learn as to what makes a good painting in with the practice, you can actually become a good artist.
So I want to challenge you on that for just a second, if you don't mind.
Sure.
All right, it's not a tough challenge.
Okay.
But, so we have this saying in our culture, which is practice makes perfect.
Perfect, right.
But the reality is practice makes permanence, right? So if you are practicing something and not getting good instruction, you will develop a bad golf swing,
Right.
or develop bad habits in painting. And that's what I was very afraid of when I first started painting, is I just knew instinctively I was not getting good instruction. I don't know how I knew it,
Right.
but I just knew it wasn't good. And if I practiced what I was learning, that I was going to develop bad habits. So
Right.
when you have a mentor like yourself, somebody you can study under, what a difference that makes.
Right, and I think that is always really in the forefront of my mind when I'm helping, when I'm teaching, is to make sure that I am basing it on good knowledge and that I'm being in tune with the student, you know, and what they're trying to achieve, and really, you know, getting in touch and giving them good guidance. I think you're right, it's very important.
You know, that's also a very important point, because being tuned into the student, and it's not easy when you have a class of 12 or 15
Right.
people, but I know so many people who have told me stories, horror stories, about how they got frustrated, they felt like they weren't getting enough help from the instructor, which happened to you. You just got lucky that you continued on.
Right, right.
And then they gave it up, and because they had this impression that it was talent required, natural talent
Right.
required, when the reality is it's a system that's learning a process,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
So you're teaching a lot of students, and now, you know, you're teaching in a lot of different modern ways, you know, on video, on Patreon, et cetera. You have a process. If you could articulate the process to me now in just kind of a basic rudimentary level, what would you say that process is?
So the process for painting for me is all about being able to slow down enough to make a plan. And I'm not a patient person, I'm impatient. I want to just get up there and paint. I don't want to slow down and make a plan.
But what is a plan?
A plan, and I'm going to, I share that in the video. I have a very easy step-by-step way to figure out what your story is for your painting, and doing that thumbnail, but I've got an easy way to do the thumbnail. Picking out my palette in advance. With pastels, I like to work with a limited palette, so I limit it before I even start. But when I approach the painting then with just those very simple things, I'm going to have a better chance of success because I have a roadmap to follow. And that just kind of guides me through the whole painting process.
Yeah, I think that a lot of us, myself included, don't put enough advanced thought into our paintings. You know, if you look at some of the old masters and you study what they've done, you'll go into a museum. I remember being in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and there's this big, giant, multi-figure painting, but beside it are 10 or 12 studies or sketches that the artist had done trying to work out their problems in advance.
Right.
How much of that kind of thing do you try to do? Do you give it much thought?
Yeah, well, like I say, I'm impatient, so I could never see myself doing that many studies because, you know, I just want to kind of get in there, and I work quickly too, so it's just all about that fun process I want to get to. But I'll spend anywhere from 20 minutes to an hour at the most on the planning part. But then I can get up there with that plan in mind and then be more passionate and more expressive and just play with the color and the mark making. But then I have to slow down at the end, and that's where I never used to do that either. Like I would just, oh, okay, this is fun, now move on to the next one. And I would never really fully resolve a painting. So I started to slow down at the end as well, and that really made a big difference.
Now, do you ever start and stop? Do you return? Do you try to get a painting done in a single session? Do you try to do them over multiple days? What do you typically?
Usually just in a day.
Really?
Well, and the reason why is because early on when I first started with pastel, I was very frustrated. I had these visions in my mind of what these paintings are supposed to look like, and of course that's not what was happening. So I started doing a small painting every day. It was the big daily painting movement was 15 years ago.
Yeah.
And then I started a blog, and just kind of that kept me going. And so I learned to work quickly, and I think I've carried that through, even though now I have much more time. I could take days if I wanted to.
Yeah.
But it's
And what's the largest you'll paint typically?
I stick around 9 by 12, but I've gone as far as 30 by 40 in a pastel. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to kind of probe the whole career thing. A lot of artists ask questions about how do you make it. We hear these legends about starving artists, right? We've all heard the Van Gogh legend. We've heard, ad nauseum.
Right.
And I'm sure there's truth to that, and I'm sure there's a lot of starving artists, but there's also a lot of successful artists that that I know who, in some cases, they're making a great living. In some cases, they're getting beyond making a great living. What is your best advice to somebody who says, I'd like to be able to, let's start simple. I'd like to be able to sell and make a little extra money every month.
Right. Just make sure that you're ready for a prime time.
How do you know?
It's hard to know, but I actually started trying to sell my work on eBay because I just wanted money to buy more pastels, and that's how I started. But I got better, my paintings were better, and I just tried to be consistent about promoting myself any way that I could. It takes work, but it's definitely doable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I typically try to recommend is find a mentor or find somebody who's objective, because my mom always used to tell me
Sure.
how wonderful my paintings
Right.
were, but she was wrong.
Okay.
She was just trying to be
Sure.
supportive.
Yeah, that's good advice.
But having an outside person say, don't tell me what's right with it, tell me what's wrong
Right.
with it. And that way you can get a dialogue going of, what can I improve?
Sure.
So did you have any mentors, people who kind of taught you along the way that kind of helped elevate you to a higher
Sure,
level?
absolutely. The artist that I studied with pastel in the beginning was Marcia Savage, and she has become a great friend, but she was just like that, would tell you the way it is,
Yeah.
and you need that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that really helped.
Yeah, I think so. And what's next? Where does this all go for you? Do you have a grand plan, or is your goal just to be able to do beautiful paintings every day?
Yeah, I know. That's a really good question. Doing beautiful paintings, exploring the medium and see how far I can push it. I've been playing with abstraction a little bit, taking an online workshop with Larry Moore recently, and just really loving that. And I'm just want to see how can I incorporate that into what I do now. So I'm always experimenting and seeing what's the next thing,
I want to point that out too, because you keep bringing up all these great points. Here you are, you're accomplished, you're well known, and you're still studying under other people.
Sure.
And it seems to be a consistent thread that I find with the top artists is no matter how accomplished they are, they're always trying to grow and learn from somebody else.
Right, absolutely. I think not only is that fun, but it just helps you grow as an artist as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Overall, you've got a lot of people watching this. They're at different levels. Some are beginners, some are accomplished. What is your best advice for someone who's trying to learn that will maybe make their journey a little bit easier?
I think when I see artists who are struggling with this idea of wanting to get better and feeling frustrated from time to time, that if we understand that getting better is a process, it's not going to be something that's overnight. I thought it would be overnight. I thought, oh, I can do this, you know, I know how to draw, I can do this. No, I needed to understand, I needed to learn the basics, how to apply them, and then I needed to take all that knowledge and practice enough so that it became more intuitive. And that takes time. So if I can give any advice, it's just kind of know where you're at in your journey and embrace that moment and enjoy that moment, because you will get better as it goes on. But when we expect it to be an overnight thing, it can get frustrating, and you know, it takes the joy out of it sometimes.
I saw a famous psychiatrist or psychologist the other day saying to embrace the pain.
Okay.
Right? Because what he said, to your point, was that we all get to a level of incompetence. Mm-hmm. We are competent at something, we get very comfortable, but then if we want to push ourselves, we have to push ourselves to a level of incompetence. In other words, how do I possibly tackle a scene like that, you know, with the glowing sunshine? And,
right.
and you have to do it a lot as an incompetent person until you get to the point of competence. And of course, if you can study under somebody great like yourself, then that helps you get there sooner, because they've already gone through all the pain.
Right.
And they can save you a lot of
sure.
a lot of difficulty.
And that's what I love to do. I like to simplify things and say, hey, this is where I struggled. Let's not struggle here, because I can make this easier for you.
So what would you like the art world, or maybe the world in general, to say about you if they look back on your paintings like we look back on a Sargent or Sorolla or someone like that? What would you like them to say about you 100 years from now?
Well, if they were just looking at my paintings, I would hope that they would say, oh, okay, I would have never thought that would be a beautiful place, but you made it beautiful. Huh. That's something that I might have walked past, you know, a field of weeds, but yet you made it beautiful.
Interesting. Now, what about if they're just talking about you?
About me, I hope that they would say, you know what, she was an inspirational teacher, and she let me know that it was okay not to be perfect and to just enjoy this painting journey that we're all on.
Very profound. You talked about seeing everyday things and finding beauty in them. How do you train yourself to do that?
The interesting part of that is recognizing that that was something that I was drawn to, and accepting that that was okay. Because I would walk past, you know, wildflowers growing at a crack in the sidewalk, and it would stop me in my tracks, and I'd be like, oh, I would love to paint that. Nah, I can't, that's just, you know, weeds in a crack. But accepting that that was exciting to me was the moment that I needed, because it gave me permission to say, you know what, this is what you need to do.
Yeah.
And then you can share that with other people that might just walk past that.
I went to a workshop one time, and we met in the middle of Oakland, California, in this little neighborhood, and we had to meet in the back alley. Park your car in the back alley. And the guy said, okay, you've got 50 feet from here, a circle of 50 feet. Find something and paint it. And all there were garage doors and garbage cans.
Sure.
And he said, you need to figure out how to find beauty in this, because if you can find beauty in this, imagine what you can do with, you know, really beautiful
Right,
things.
Exactly.
So that reminded me of that.
Yeah, that's fun. That would be a fun exercise to try.
I oftentimes talk about that when we're an artist, we see things differently. How do you see the world when you're driving down the road or you're walking down the street? How do you see things? I'm
drawn to color and to interesting light in shadow patterns. I think that's the most, and maybe that's why I like the weeds, you know, the wildflowers. If there's interesting light on it, you know, that catches my attention. And I never used to see it that way. And when it was, well, I actually started taking photography classes, which I highly recommend for any artist.
Great idea.
Because it helps you with your composition, because you have one shot at it and you can't really move things around. So you've got to find the right composition. And you have to wait for that perfect light. So that's when I started to see it. And what I like now about being able to paint is, you know, I can see it, and also I can kind of paint it even if it's not there.
Are you painting on location?
I do, but I work from photos a lot
Yeah.
too. So I do a combination.
There's a story, there's a great photographer by the name of Fred Picker. And Fred studied with Ansel Adams, and he has a very famous photograph, which is in the Galapagos Islands, and, you know, with the big monoliths. And he takes a boat out there and he sets up his camera, and his rule is I take one picture.
Okay.
He uses the big film and the
Sure.
big view camera. And he gets out there and it's a completely overcast day and there's no light and it's not interesting. And he's trying to make a decision of what he's going to do. Am I going to pack up and go somewhere else? And so he just sits down and eats a sandwich and he says, I'm just going to sit here. He said, I sat there for 8 hours and all of a sudden a little peak in the clouds opened up and a beam of light came down, and just at that same time, a herd of horses ran right under the light.
Right.
And he's like, boom,
Yeah,
got it.
we got it.
And for us as painters, though, you can't paint that light that quickly. So how do you develop a memory training?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I take a lot of pictures, so that helps, you know, get my memories back from those moments like that. But, you know, if it really is striking, you know, I'm going to remember it.
And pictures lie, though.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which is why, and I did talk about this in my video, is when we're working from photos, we do need to be aware of the limitations, and of course highly recommend getting outside and paint, or I like to say paint in your mind, where you just go out and, you know, pretend you were painting. At least you're feeding your mind with those images that you need to interpret photos better.
Are you one of those people who's like always painting everything?
Always.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, like you're staring at the cameras out there thinking, okay, how could I paint them?
Exactly. Yeah. The neon lights when we're walking downtown, and yeah, how would I do that? It's just, it's always exciting.
I love artists and I love getting to know you, and I love artists because they see the world differently. And every artist is a little bit different, but you know, when we're walking down the street, last night we went to downtown Austin, we're walking down having dinner, and we're walking and we see all these beautiful old antique neon signs.
Right.
And we both had the same comments, like how would we paint that?
Right, exactly.
You know, and here we are standing in the dark, how would we paint that? How would we get the feel, the glow, the light? And other people are like not even noticing.
No, they don't even see it. Yeah. But that's our job. We need to, you know, show them, you know, what they're missing.
Well, you've shown us a lot today. Thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time, and you've been a big inspiration to a lot of artists, and you're an inspiration to me, and I'm just honored to meet you. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Eric. It's been such a pleasure being here, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to get to know you better and to have a chat with you.
Well, thank you. Our inspiration today, Karen Margulis, a great pastel painter. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes. Well, that's Karen Margulis, Expressive Pastel Painting. You can learn more about it at painttube.tv. We have a discount code for you up in the comments section. Make sure to check that out. Thank you for watching. I'm Eric Rhodes.
Hi, I'm Karen Margulis. Welcome to my workshop. In this video, we're going to explore the pastel medium, and I'm going to share my tips and techniques that will enable us to use pastel to help us loosen up and add more expression to our paintings. I'm going to be starting off sharing my very simple map approach to starting a painting, and then we're going to move on and I'm going to share ways that we can introduce texture to our pastel paintings. And that's unique because it's hard to get texture in a pastel paintings, but I've got some ways that I want to share with you that'll really help us pump up that texture. I think what's holding students back often is they jump in too quickly and don't slow down enough to make a plan before they start. I like to say make a plan and then we plan to let go. And that's what's going to help us paint with more expression, is to go into a painting having a plan in place so that you can approach that blank piece of paper with confidence. I think any time that you can have a step-by-step map approach, which is what I like to call it, it gives us confidence to approach the painting, and we overcome that fear of failure and the fear of messing up our paintings because we have something simple to follow, and allows us to loosen up and add that life into our paintings rather than feel like we're compelled to copy everything we see in front of us. These are very simple step-by-step methods that can be applied to any subject. We're grounded in the basics. We need that for everything we paint, and we can use all of the things that I share for anything you would like to paint. This video will really help students' painting skills because we go back to the basics. So not only the basics of what makes a good painting, color, value, composition, but I also teach tips and techniques on handling pastel so that we get beautiful layers of color without creating mud. And I introduce how to create light and how to create texture, and all these things will result in stronger paintings. I think what's really exciting is the ability we have to create interesting underpaintings. The texture part is a lot of fun, but I also share how we can layer pastel to get beautiful color without creating mud. And I teach you how not to overwork that painting, which is also a trap that we get into often. So I've got a lot of great tips that I'm going to share that will help us have great paintings.